All right, good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever on the globe you might be joining us from. Greetings and welcome to SIDS Talk Plastics. My name is Saeed Hamid and I support the chair of AOSIS in its work towards the development of an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. SIDS Talk Plastics is a series of webinars which bring together representatives from SIDS and other experts to discuss priority areas in the ongoing negotiations. Today marks the third installment in this series, and we will be reflecting on the second session of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee, which recently concluded in Paris a few short weeks ago. We have assembled a rather esteemed panel of speakers for our discussion today, all of whom were at INC-2 and no doubt have much to share about the proceedings at the event. Without further delay and in no particular order, please join me in welcoming Ms. Asha Challenger, First Secretary at the Mission of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN and Vice Chair and Rapporteur of the INC. Mr. Halatoa Fuad, Director of the National Environment Service, Cook Islands. Ms. Fazila Ahmed Shahim, Associate Legal Counsel, Ministry of Environment, Maldives. Dr. Alexandra Harrington, Chair for the Agreement on Plastic Pollution Task Force, IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, and Ms. Marta Longhurst, Plastics Initiative Global Plastics Treaty Manager from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Thank you all for joining us today, and without further delay, I will now hand over first to Asha to deliver some brief remarks on INT2, followed by Halatoa, then Fazila, and Alexandra and Marta. Thank you all.
Good day, everyone, and thank you, Saeed, for inviting me to participate in this third installment of SIDS Talks Plastics. Very happy to just provide a brief debrief on the events in Paris. So just overall, first, I think INC-2 in essence delivered what we needed in order to start substantive negotiations at INC-3. We have mandated the chair with support from the Secretariat to prepare a zero draft. And I think this was the most substantive outcome that I think we were hoping for, and we got that. So I'm happy for that. So I think that's a positive way to start. So just some general background on the proceedings. There were more than 2,000 participants, over 700 delegates from 169 member states, and over 900 observers. It was the meeting was very well attended. It was hosted in France at the beautiful UNESCO headquarters, and it was under the chairmanship of our able chair, His Excellency Gustavo Meza Quadra. So I just want to point out some of the main outcomes from the session. So as I said, again, we were able to give the mandate to the chair to prepare a zero draft of the treaty ahead of INC-3. Also, the Secretariat requested to invite submissions on elements that were not discussed at INC-2, and some delegations spoke about principles and scope, and also potential areas for intercessional work. And those came from lists that were compiled by the co-facilitators in the contact groups, and this should inform the work of INC-3. Some deadlines, I think there's the August 15th deadline for observers and 15th September for member states. So we have a busy summer. Another outcome of this meeting is that the Bureau was finally elected. We got through some of the procedural hurdles, so we finally have a fully constituted Bureau. I'm very happy. The informal Bureau that we had was not representative, and I think it was very important that Georgia and Estonia have joined the Bureau. We had to vote because of challenges to Sweden and the US. And also we confirmed Antigua and Barbuda for SIDS, Ecuador for GRULAC, Senegal and Rwanda for African group, and Japan and Jordan for the Asia Pacific group. So we have a fully constituted Bureau, and I can say that as a Bureau, we're ready to get working. Another agreement was that the next venues were finalized. So we know that INC-3 will be in Nairobi, INC-4 will be in Ottawa, Canada, INC-5 will be in the Republic of Korea. And we also had an offer to host the diplomatic conference on the floor from Rwanda, although that is not yet finalized. So as part of the work, we know that quite a bit of time, particularly in day 1 and 2, was taken up on voting rights. And we all agreed on an interpretive paragraph for the draft rules of procedure that will be placed on the rules of procedure that will continue to be applied on a provisional basis to the work of the INC. So just some of my key observations, and Said, please let me know if I'm running out of time. I think that it was clear that delegations are ready to get started on substantive matters. There was some disappointment and maybe some frustration with the slow start of the INC. The first 2 days were taken up with these procedural matters. They were important, but we only had 5 days, and it really took up a lot of time. I'd say it took some steam from our work. Although we were able to come out with our major outcomes, who knows how much more we would have been able to discuss and finalize if we had those additional hours. So the contact groups only had 1 full day to literally speed through the elements papers. And I think this was a bit of a disservice to the entire process. I think moving forward, as we speak about contact groups, I think they should be structured in a way that supports more detailed discussions. I think because of the timeline and maybe some of the formatting, delegations really just reiterated their position. So they just highlighted again what they submitted in their submissions, and that's fine, but I don't know how much further that took us. We did hear that there are things that were not included in the elements paper that were requested for the elements paper. So some delegations took the time to highlight those as well. But I think that we need to think through the format of those 2 wide contact groups and break down into maybe more informal groups, smaller contact groups that drill into some of these issues that delegations have mentioned. And I think that's reflected clearly in the very, very long list of proposed possibilities for informal groups and intersessional work that both contact groups came out with. There's a lot more things that member states want to talk about that we know need to be included in the zero draft and need to be considered. Some areas where there are conversions, some areas where there's not much convergence. So we need to pick through those and find the best ways to address them in a meaningful way. So for these discussions, I think it is anticipated that the fewer INCs will be longer than 5 days. We already have essentially 6 days because we've always had the additional day at the top for for regional coordination. I think that will be expanded, and I'm hoping that we can have maybe 6 or 7 days of substantive work days, contact groups organized so that those topics can be addressed. And I think I will stop there, and happy to hear from others and happy to participate in the panel afterwards. Thank you, Saeed.
Thank you, Asha. I was just about to start waving because, but I do appreciate all the inputs that you're giving. I think you're really laying the foundation for what some of the questions might come up with later in terms of what transpired at INC-2. So we really appreciate the updates there. I will now hand the floor over to Halatoa.
Thank you, Saeed, and greetings, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk in this AOSIS talk. Firstly, just want to extend congratulations to Asha for the confirmation of the Bureau members. I think that despite the debates at the INC-2, there are some good milestones that we need to celebrate, and having the Bureau members confirmed is a big milestone for us. And obviously, I think Asha's done a really good summary of overview of the INC-2 in terms of the substantive matters in the having a mandate to prepare zero draft, as well as having our INC venues confirmed for the next INCs. And all the Bureau members confirmed. I think it's good to acknowledge some of those key measures. I think for me, in terms of some of the outstanding matters that we need to work on from here is obviously the rules of procedure has not been resolved. We have the Rule 37 still bracketed, as well as a statement in Rule 38.1. And I think the procedural issue will continue to be a major discussion in INC-3. So having ample time to have these discussions will be very important. And it's good that Asha has noted that we're looking at extending to about 6 or 7 days. That'll give a lot of time for us to have these substantive matters. The intersessional plans obviously are not clear or formalized as we might like, and having a clear process on some of the intersessional work on the substantive matters will be good for us, as it'll save a lot of time for us in INC-3. And obviously continue our engagement with the Pacific, as well as AOSIS and other groups like the High Ambition Coalition. I think if I was to reflect as a SIDS, from a Pacific point of view, we were very fortunate with the leadership of Palau. They did an exemplary job in leading the Pacific. We were very fortunate to have intersessional working groups leading into the INC. So we had, following the engagements by our Pacific Secretariat, which is SPREP, from January 2023, we helped, there was a lot of assistance provided to the Pacific to make submissions in February. And we managed to have a preparatory meeting here in the Cook Islands where all the member states came here from the Pacific to have a preparatory meeting in April. And then from there, we used a lot of the discussions to understand more of the options paper and what sort of options are available to the member countries. We then followed it up with a 2-day preparatory meeting in Paris. So we all arrived a bit early, and we had our Pacific preparatory meeting on the Thursday and Friday as a lead up to the INC the following week. So that was very useful for us. And I think Palau's leadership in the PSIDS really cemented a lot of our convergence in areas. We reached consensus. So going into the INC-2 discussions on the Monday, all of our statements were all prepared. So I think having that sort of model and that momentum is important for us to keep in the next, for the next INC. AOSIS and PSIDS, we've proven to have a strong voice in this group, and it's important to keep this momentum intersessionally and having a clear plan for areas that SIDS want to focus on. And being champions and stewards for the marine elements is a clear area of attention, but also on the upstream measures that can help stop some of the tidal plastics into the future. We understand that the period now between INC-2 and INC-3 we're quite divided in terms of before the zero draft and after the zero draft. So before the draft is a good time to really look at areas that we need more knowledge and information. So I'm talking from Cook Islands perspective. Once we receive the template for submissions that are due in August and September, we'll be looking at getting more technical sort of advice on some of the key areas around science that we really need to strengthen as we prepare for INC-3. I think we, as SIDS, we also need to look at engaging more bilaterally with delegations from other regions who may have common interest in priorities, start mapping up priority areas for SIDS focused, just for example, on dealing with production, but any clear ask on remediation and legacy that can be used to complement measures upstream and acquiring more knowledge on trade provisions. So from a Cook Islands perspective, we'll be looking, one of the areas that we want to play a bit more actively going into the INC-3 is to be more engaged bilaterally and looking at other regions and working together with PSIDS and AOSIS on how we can engage more with other regions. The SIDS, one of the reflections I have from INC-2 is that as SIDS, we've demonstrated that we can be a very powerful and ambitious bloc, and it'll be good to see more of this in INC-3. So more engagement in the content groups on the substantive matters. And we would also put in a formal submission in the areas that we'd like to collaborate in further into the new process. So I think going into the INC-3, I think the increasing of engagement is very important. And just going back into what Usher has mentioned in the substantive work, there's going to be a lot of work. So having a lot of time for us to have those negotiations at INC-3 will be very important. As we're going into the text drafting, is going to be quite long hours in how we can agree to these negotiations. I think I'll pause here for now, Said, and I'll be happy to take on more questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo, and I really appreciate your emphasis on more engagement. I think that'll be really important, especially given the limited sessions remaining. I think as much as we can engage with others who share similar interests would help to advance our negotiations when these sessions actually begin. So thank you for raising that point. Thirdly, we will now take Fazila. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Said. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to begin with, to shed some light on the experiences and key observations. I'll keep brief because Asha's and Halato has already covered loads of what I was already going to say. So I'll just keep it to very brief. Coming from INC-1 to INC-2, we were very ambitious block. We wanted to make progress. We were prepared to participate, engage, advocate, and even make very compelling. We were very prepared in the sense to make very compelling reasons to put forward to the legally binding instrument. Coming from a member state national delegation, I think at INC-2, we did struggle for a quite long time to make progress, despite a lot of means being paved to make progress. We did struggle, and a lot of national delegates did feel, including observers, did feel that we did lose a lot of time despite, but we certainly do acknowledge that a lot of issues were resolved, and we certainly did make substantive progress, especially on progressive measures. At this point, all hope is lost. Negotiations tend to become like this. We are going to be heading into more in-depth, sort of lengthy, long nights, and I think we just got to be a bit patient, and we're looking forward. We're definitely a very ambitious group, and we've had very good coordination. We've had a lot of support for the prep of INC, well way ahead of the actual meeting. We did have a lot of preparatory meetings. We did have a lot of information disseminated to the member states. So it was a lot easy coming from member states, and a lot of awareness was brought into much before the actual meeting started. And the regional coordination meetings, they were excellent. A lot of good coordination were held, and a lot of good communication and information was disseminated, which really helped the member states progress as well. So I'll keep it brief. I'll stop right now, and then once we go into the specific questions, we can go a bit detail on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fazila. I'll now hand the floor over to Alex.
Of course, thank you very much, Said, and everyone who's been involved in hosting this series. It's great to be back in the series and to be part of it again, and to see so many familiar faces. Many of the points that I wanted to highlight were already made in terms of the importance of getting to the zero draft, especially. And the zero draft obviously was a bit contentious, like especially getting the final wording down, and the 4 hours that were spent kind of trying to do that were intense, challenging, but I think we all understand that this is not going to be an easy process. And I think that's one of the first takeaways, is that no matter how much we might discuss the procedural issues, which are quite critical, and which we will have to keep remembering as we move down the line, not only towards hopefully having a zero draft and then moving on with that, but also for the implementation of the treaty itself, it is important to remember that we did get to the zero draft at the end of the day, which is quite critical. I do think it is important to take away from this, and then also looking at the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention COP several weeks beforehand, and now also the UNFCCC COP in Bonn, or the mid-intersessional that's going on now in Bonn. The idea that procedure is starting to play a very critical role in the way that we think of MEAs. In a very different light, in a way that many of us had not thought of as lawyers, as practitioners, as scholars. And it is framing the discussions in a way that is not necessarily reflective of the level of input that was put into drafting the regulatory framework. So I think this is a key takeaway for me from INC-2 and 4.3 and beyond, is the idea of having to really keep procedural aspects in mind. I do think we heard a number of really interesting points coming together that will be in focus not only for INC-3 and for whatever is in the zero draft, but also what comes next. Things like just transitions, obviously circularity we've been talking about for a while, but trying to really have a sense of what that means. Also the idea of regime convergence, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, and trade concerns, intellectual property concerns, et cetera. And the focus on having capacity building, on having a financial mechanism, and on having technology transfer, which is quite evident in so many of the pre-INC-2 statements, was resoundingly nearly universal, which I thought was a very positive sign. Now, there will be many definitions of what this means in practice and in theory, and what is capacity building, and how do we have a financial mechanism that's actually funded so we don't have a similar thing as loss and damage now in the UNFCCC, et cetera. But the idea is that so many, the vast majority of countries expressed support for this, that I think it really was a quite valuable thing to highlight coming out, because this means that it will be hopefully at the core of whatever we do adopt finally as the treaty. So I'll stop there, and then we'll get into some other points later, but thank you, Saeed.
Thank you, Alex. And I'll now hand over to Marta, and I know you have a presentation, so I will let you share screen, but I just want to remind the attendees as well that you can use the Q&A feature to send in any questions, and we will get to them closer to the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed, and thank you for inviting me to share the perspective from observers' point of view and some reflections. First, before I only have a few slides, I promise, but I just wanted to acknowledge as well the special position that SIDS countries are in terms of being impacted by the plastic pollution, and frankly, contributing very little to the production, yet having the impacts from the environmental and economic point of view. And in the light of that, I wanted from the foundation's point of view, compliment on the ambitious position that we've seen SIDS countries bring to the negotiations. That was very much welcomed. So from our perspective, I represented Ellen MacArthur Foundation, but we also were at INC together with WWF, bringing the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty to bring the voice of the industry to the negotiations. So just a couple of words on the foundation. We've been working for more than a decade on driving the change from linear to circular economy, with a very strong focus on the upstream part, so reduction, elimination, innovation to make sure that the materials are recyclable and reusable in practice and at scale, and that they're kept out of the environment and incineration. And the Business Coalition convenes the organizations across plastics value chain and financial institutions and NGOs, and are also advocating for regulation around reduction, circulation, and prevention. So in terms of our reflections, and I think that's been noted many times now about the concern about the lengthy discussions on the procedural matters. So it's interesting to hear that it wasn't just the observers, and actually, speaking to the delegations, we saw that there was frustration on that part. And I think that still remains a bit of a concern, that the topic unresolved will come back on subsequent INCs. Positive, again, echoing what was said, we were very encouraged to see the mandate for zero draft. I guess we just hope that when it comes through, it reflects the many ambitious positions, especially with regards to the upstream measures and reduction, because we can't just focus on recycling. Recycling won't allow us to get out of the crisis. We also were positively encouraged by a support for globally binding rules. Of course, it's difficult to have globally binding rules for everything, but and we acknowledge that there needs to be a flexibility for some special and local circumstances, but it feels like there was also support for globally binding rules. And we also saw that there was convergence around specific topics, and I think, Alexandra, you referenced that as well. For example, support around defining criteria for problematic and unnecessary plastics and circularity design criteria. Now, on the flip side, there were some elements for, again, where we thought there could be a bit more convergence, but there wasn't. So especially reduction there are divergent views on reduction, whereas it's critical to tackle plastic pollution, especially if we want to stay within the 1.5 degree climate pathway. The other area, just going to flick back, is around reuse. So we thought that there was support for a global obligation, support for inclusion of reuse in the instrument, but actually there were mixed attitudes to obligations on reuse targets and design standards. And again, from our voluntary commitment work, we know that to enable scaling of reuse, we recommend that the treaty contains obligations for countries to introduce policies such as targets and standards. But again, having the flexibility to allow national legislation, for example, that could require economic operators to join a shared reuse system. So in conclusion, I think we basically very pleased about the zero draft. But in order to, I guess, realize the ambitions to end plastic pollution, the zero draft needs to contain clear policy measures that help us get there. So that piece of work now will be really important. And from NGOs' point of view, from our point of view, we're there to provide information and expertise gained from our voluntary commitment programs, because there are some already useful starting points that could be used for that, for example, next step for intercessional work, for the annexes. But also we're here to support the capacity building and clarify any key concepts and how they can work in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. So I think we managed to cover a lot of what the key highlights and challenges might have been at INC-2. Having done that, though, I think a good segue before we get into the more substantive elements would be, are there any lessons learned that you think could be useful for improving the negotiation process, not just at INC-3, but the other INCs that are upcoming? We know we have 3 sessions remaining, and hopefully with the intent of finalizing this agreement by the end of next year. What are some of the lessons learned that you think could help us drive ambition, push this process along faster and more effectively towards meeting this, this goal of 2024? I think I will start first with Asha.
Thanks, Said. So I think we need more time. I think 5 days is not enough, clearly. But that being said, we don't want, if we go to 10 days, then 5 days are taken up with procedural arguments as well. So that would defeat the purpose. So I think the procedural matters, I think we should find a place for that, whether that be an informal group or contact group, so that that can be addressed alongside the substantive matters. Because if some member states clearly feel very strongly about this, then we have to allow for ventilation of their issues so that they're comfortable, so that they see that there's transparency. So we need to have those discussions. So that would be my thought on how we can effectively manage everybody's concerns at the same time go into substantive matters. And I do think that the chair made that attempt. He called contact groups, informal groups to handle those issues. But I think front loading those discussions into contact groups or informal groups, however they're called, so that delegations can know we're talking about rules of procedure here. And then at the same time, we're talking about national action plans at the same time, consecutively. So I think that would be helpful. And I'll happy to hear other thoughts.
Thank you, Asha. And I think I see a lot of nodding across all the other panelists. So I sense there's a degree of agreement there. Would anyone else like to take the floor on this matter? I saw as well that there was a question in the chat on this particular topic as well. So I think you managed to share some of what those ideas might look like to prevent this deadlock on the rules of procedure. Perhaps Fazila, would you like to take the floor?
Sure, thanks, Said. Certainly a lot of patience is required. We are oftentimes very frustrated. We tend to get very overwhelmed because we simply cannot progress. And adding on to what Asha mentioned, time, probably we need to allocate more time, but also manage time effectively, perhaps allocating more time on, obviously we'll need to hear all the states that are very concerned with the procedure, especially the procedural matters. So perhaps allocating time specifically to resolve these issues. But for states, obviously, there was a lot of frustration, a lot of drain, basically waiting, hoping we can move to make progress. But honestly, I think a lot of patience at this point, to add on to what Asha just mentioned.
Yeah, I think Asha put it with her first statement when she mentioned that it's taking away a lot of the steam the delegations come with to really dive into the substantive matters. Perhaps Halatoy, would you like to add anything to this?
Thank you, Said. It seems like the word time has come up a lot, and I think just reflecting back on INC-2, going into the first day, the plan was to have the national and regional statements read out on the first day, and we didn't do that until Wednesday. So I think having that sort of understanding of how long it'll take for the procedure matters, especially with the Rule 37 and 38, perhaps to allocate that ample time to address that. We also had a lot of discussions about doing intersessional work between now and INC-3. But I think the consensus we reached from INC-2 was that we identify these potential areas for intersessional work to be tabled in the submissions that we're about to make. So I think there's what I did notice in INC-2 is, despite the debates and the long discussions and the informal consultations, at the end of the day, it's a very hardworking group of delegates, and having these hardworking group of delegates, we were able to pull things at the end of the week. So I think having that hardworking team is a good thing for us. And just to capitalize that, we just need more time and having more opportunities for intersessional work so that we can map out a lot of these points of divergence between now and INC, so that when we get to INC, then the work is more based on the substantive matters.
Of course, and I think everyone here was on the ground as well, and was fully aware of all the pivoting that we needed to do when it came to running to contact groups that were smushed together in terms of timings, and then not being able to attend some of the side events because you have to prepare for sessions arising on other matters. So I think it really kind of took away the steam of the work that we could have achieved. Marta, would you like to throw in a few thoughts here, or Alex?
Yeah, So I just wanted to pop in briefly and say that I think doing events like this frequently. So obviously, while there's still some momentum, as tired as it might be from INC-2, but then also just keeping this going and having engaged stakeholders, involved states, but also NGOs, other observers, IGOs, et cetera, have discussions, have public fora, have spaces where we can all get together and speak will really be critical, because when there was the decision not to hold a specific intersessional event before the day before everything starts at INC-3, there are obviously very important reasons for that, and many financial concerns and many practical concerns. But what we lost was the ability to have this type of dialogue. And since we don't have that type of dialogue officially being facilitated, it is important to use the resources that we have available to really get a lot of the issues that we have coming up clarified. So we know what those are, we know how to address them, we know how to anticipate them, rather than being surprised by them, as well as any other potential regulatory, please no, but in case there are any more regulatory issues that may come up, or repeats of them, having those then derail us as well. And I apologize for the sound of the ambulance in the background. It's like the only time I ever hear it in England. Anyway, thank you.
You're fine. I didn't hear anything. I was going to say, if you say any other procedural issues, you should throw some salt over your back. Marta, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, my only build, because there's so many ideas put on the table already, my only build, and I think Halatoa mentioned it before about bilateral engagements and whether there's any scope for knowing that these procedural matters will arise. How can you preempt and and then engage to really understand the concerns and try to alleviate or solve any of it beforehand? So yeah.
Thank you. Asha, I see you'd like to take the floor.
Yes, just building on what Marta said and how it's all said about bilaterals. It's easy for us to have bilaterals with like-minded groups, but we should also ensure that we have bilaterals with those that we don't have, that there may be, we may not have the same ideas, so that we can understand where they're coming from, so that we can build those bridges, so that we can either both be similarly dissatisfied or similarly pleased with the outcome. But I think it's important to hear from those delegations who, who may be taking the floor on matters when that's, hearing all our collective eye rolls when we're ready to move on. And I'm being honest, it can be an easy position to be in. You have to take your instructions from Capital, whether or not it's popular on the floor. I've been there before, so I know what it's like. So we should really, I encourage us to reach out to some of those delegations that have, whose ideas we think may not be as ambitious as ours, and try to, so that we can see where each other are coming from, so that we can build something that will work for everyone.
Thank you. And I think that's a really good distinction to make in organizing your bilaterals between now and INC-3, if you want to really drive the highest ambition and meet compromise where possible. So now getting into some of the substantive matters, we know that as previously mentioned by many of you, we had 2 contact groups at INC-2 over a rather short period of time. We had contact group 1, which discussed the objectives and substantive obligations, and then we had contact group 2 that focused on means of implementation measures, and additional matters. So I would like to dive into some of your thoughts on how these contact groups were conducted. I know Asha talked about how they were organized a little bit, but a little bit more emphasis on what your thoughts are on the conduct of these groups and the level of discussions which ensued. We can start with contact group 1 and then have a discussion in contact group 2, but just general thoughts on how these contact groups proceeded. Perhaps we can start now and shake things up with Halatoa.
Yeah, thank you, Said. I think for contact group 1, which I was involved in, it was really good to hear the positions of various groups, as well as some of the national positions that were given. And I think having an understanding of where convergence are. So there were some areas that we were quite pleased with, some of the groups wanting a more ambitious sort of position, especially around the problematic plastics and chemicals of concern. And we also did note some of the areas that there was not, that we didn't have any much convergence on, especially around voluntary measures, and looking at some of the positions around production not being really clear from some of the member states. So I think for the a bulk of the statements that were read at the contact groups, we were wondering whether, if we have a similar sort of position in the next INCs, how do we move those statements before the INC? Is there any way that we can distribute some of these positions prior, so that we, you know, going into the INCs where you only have 5 working days, it's very tight. And then, you know, like this is where the discussions around intersessional work was quite strong from our groups and from AOSIS, to try and alleviate some of the pressures that we have during that week. So I think that's something that would be very useful going into the INC-3. We also noted that in the contact groups, at the very beginning, we spent a couple of hours just trying to understand what is the mandate of the contact groups. So having very clear sort of indication of what, you know, what's the objectives and what we want to achieve from those sessions can save a bit of time for us, or shave a bit of the hours that we we spend into the early hours of the morning. But otherwise, it was a very interesting part to really just understand the positions, and this will form some of some good sort of leeway for us to have those bilateral discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alto. And I think you mentioned a good point there, because me having sat in a contact group too, I was there when there was a bit of frustration in the room when people were not aware as to how the questions would have been structured, what the guiding questions even were. So I think having that information beforehand really allows delegates to prepare. Alex, would you like to jump in here?
Oh, I definitely would. Thank you, Saeed. You know, I'm always happy to dive into just about anything. First of all, I absolutely agree that I think when we are conceiving of the mandates, we really need them to be quite clear, quite concise. And then when we think about making sure the rules are all known, how much time will be had for speaking, what it means to report back, all of these things, which I think there was a bit of uncertainty about, given that INC-2 was the first real advance for looking for the zero draft negotiation process. Hopefully we can avoid some of this for INC-3. The other thing that I noticed a bit of confusion on, and that I think needs to be clarified, as I was in contact group 1 throughout the duration, was the idea of what the intention behind the options paper actually was. And was it intended to be something that was, these are the list of options and that's it? Was it intended to be something that was a guideline from which other ideas could flow and flow freely? And then how did that filter into the discussion? And so certainly you had some states that were quite willing to come in and make their own suggestions and their own comments outside of what was in the options paper. You had some that seemed to be very much attached to what was in the options paper. And it wasn't really clear if that was because it was something that they agreed with, or they felt that they had to pick and choose from the options that were there. So I think, again, greater clarity of what will be coming forward as being an option, but not being something that is a mandatory element, would be very much valuable, especially to states that have fewer resources in terms of legal officers, as well as time and financial resources to really understand the intricacies. If we can explain as much as possible in advance, it can be very helpful for framing the arguments that will come in, for knowing what they should be, for framing the submissions that then go into those arguments, etc. But I think that, Saeed, you and I had that conversation as a side note anyway. So you knew that was coming.
We sure did. Asha, would you like to add a few thoughts here?
Thanks, Saeed. Yeah, and I support what Halatoa and Alex said. I think so I have to thank and praise the co-facilitators. They had one day to speed through an elements paper, and we got to the end of it, and I was in awe of that. I think because of the timeline provided, it was difficult for full elaboration of issues. So as Alex said, some were really wedded to their submissions that they saw reflected or maybe did not see reflected. But I do think that through the outcomes or the reports, we could see areas where member states highlighted things that were missing from their estimation, were missing from the elements paper. And I think that that was helpful as well, because we want, I think, and everything I say here is from Asha Challenger's perspective. I think that we want a full zero draft. We don't want a partial zero draft. So the elements paper only allowed for requested submissions on certain areas. I know AOSIS felt very strongly that the elements paper was not as substantive as it could be, and that there were more, that a lot was missing in order to get to a zero draft. So I'm confident that pulling from the reports of the co-facilitators and also submissions, we can get a full balanced zero draft. It won't be all what we want to see, but ensuring that all member states are able to see their perspectives, and then we take it to INC-3, 4, and 5 to make those compromises, to do the finalizing and editing and removing and streamlining as needed.
Thank you, Asha. Not to further plug AOSIS's position, but I would say too that this is why we were saying that conversations on structure, for example, are really important to have simultaneously when we're talking about obligations and the means of implementation of the other structural elements, without talking about what this agreement's design could look like. And this is something we've been advocating for quite some time. Fazila, would you like to add any thoughts here?
Yeah, just briefly adding on to what was already highlighted. We did lose a lot of time in terms of not knowing exactly what the contact groups were supposed to do. There was a lot of confusion as to what exactly was required of the contact groups. So perhaps for the upcoming meetings, more clarity could be would be helpful. But like Asha mentioned, the co-facilitators, they did excellent job. They merely did not have sufficient time, but they did manage to ultimately cover all the elements that were supposed to be covered. I attended the contact group too, and like Sai just mentioned, we did struggle a little bit with in terms of what exactly we were supposed to do, and we did lose substantive amount of time, not exactly knowing what we really needed to do. But once we did get flowing, we did make good progress. But for future meetings, this is probably something that could be improved, and we'd like to see that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Fazila. Yeah, because the first hour and a half, I think, of contact group 2 was having a discussion on how it's going to be structured, what the questions are, and trying to understand the process, which is valuable time when you're looking at, I think that was Thursday or late in the night Wednesday. Marta, would you like to add any thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I completely agree again with what's been said. That's I definitely, I was mainly in contact group 1, and I definitely had the sense of there's surely, because it was a reaction that the member states had to the options paper. It felt there was a lot of we support option B too, and so it felt like what other speakers have said, there could have been some pre-work done, maybe, you know, showing, I don't know, voting or majority converge around this, that maybe. I guess what I would then, and listening to everybody else, question on my mind is, what will this zero draft produce then, and how will that be different to the options paper, and then how to make then that work, and then the negotiations effective, to kind of not repeat what happened, I guess, with the options paper and with the work of the contact groups. That, I guess, that's what's on my mind now. Yeah, so not a solution, another question really.
So, okay, moving right along, I think we're going to bundle up some of the last remaining questions in the interest of time, but I was going to ask, put it out to everyone, were there any issues of high priority that were not adequately discussed at INC-2? Because like Asha, I was also, well, for myself, I will say I was a little pessimistic that we would finish the options paper in the limited time. And surprisingly, we did. But I also worried that we did not get to have as in-depth conversations about some of the really high priority issues. So having attended and seen some of the work of these contact groups and seen the reports, are there any issues of high priority that you think are not adequately discussed just yet, especially issues of importance to SIDS? And what would you think would help feed into the design of intersectional work before INC-3 based on what those issues could be? I will start first. I know it's a loaded question, so I'll start first with Asha.
Oh, yeah, that is quite a layered question, Saeed. And to be honest, I think that I don't think any of the issues were really able to be elaborated sufficiently because we had to really rush through it. So, and in that aspect, I would say that most of the SIDS priorities were not fully discussed. We were able to so I was in contact group 1 and we were able to take the floor and deliver our interventions and hear other interventions, but we just had to quickly move on to the next, which wasn't the best way to come to convergence. And I think most of it, like I said, was just reiteration of what's in the options paper. We were able to highlight, and then speaking from AOS, we were able to highlight our concerns about discussions on structure and those sort of things. And I trust that those were reflected in the reports. So I trust that those will pour into the zero draft somehow. But remind me of the other parts of your question, Saeed, or I can, let me let others talk in the meantime. Thank you.
Sure, no worries. Halatoa, would you like to add?
Thank you for the question. I think the one point that comes to mind is the timing of the science and technical body. I know that in the contact group 2, it was one of the outcomes of contact group 2 to have to consider the potential establishment of a science and technical body. When we talked about the chemicals of concern, problematic plastics, intentional microplastics that we want to try and reduce and eliminate, you almost needed like the annexes, which I know that some member states felt strongly that we shouldn't go straight into intersessional working group because they might lead into preempting some sort of annexes. But I think in the context of plastic, we need that sort of prescriptive information to help us make those decisions. I mean, we talked about chemicals with plastic polymers, like 13,000 types of chemicals. I mean, it's going to be quite a substantive work. And I think having delays in the science and technical body being established can be quite problematic in terms of getting into the nitty-gritty work that needs to be done. So I think if there's some sort of way that we can try and expedite this body's establishment, I know it's in the appendix and it's in the contact group discussions, but it hasn't been formalized. And I know that the science, the members of the science body is crying out for opportunities that they can help. So I think that's an area that we really need from a member state perspective. We really need the science to start kicking into the work in INC. Thank you.
Thanks, Halato. And I think you raised a good point there. I think a question also came in on the possible creation of technical working groups during the intersessional period that can help inform the negotiators. And I think that's something AOSIS had mentioned in its opening statement, not to plug our position again, but that was something we mentioned, that some of this technical work needs to start as soon as possible. That would then lead into the development and the design of the scientific and technical body under the instrument, because the science and technical nature of the issue needs to be started. That discussion needs to start now, so we can start developing these annexes and negotiating their content. So I think that's a really important point to raise. Would anyone else like to add any thoughts here? I know we're running short in time. I have one final question for you all, and I would just crave your indulgence for another 5 minutes or so. Hopefully that's all right.
Can I just add one other kind of endorsement of the need for the science policy? First of all, for someone who went to law school because they don't understand science as well as they probably should, please help us and understand. But more seriously, because there was such a discussion at various points in both contact groups about potential either intersections with or overlaps with BRS, with Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention. And there were several states that kept saying, you know, this will be a problem, it will trigger a problem, and so we shouldn't necessarily touch these areas in the treaty because there will be an overlap. I think it's really critical that as soon as we can, we have that science and technologically based entity, science, policy, technology together, so that we can inform each other of what the annexes might look like, what the covered substances might look like, and whether there really is a nexus with BRS or not. In some senses there are, in some senses they're not. Also, BRS adopted technical guidelines, but it didn't actually necessarily change the annexes or its own amendments in a way that would be reflective of a legal requirement. So that all, I think, needs to be very much discussed in tandem with the idea of the scientific body. And the other thing that needs, I think, to support the scientific body call quite quickly needs to be remembered is that there is the parallel discussion on the open-ended working group in the UNEP context to create the science policy body for pollution and for pollutants of concern and chemical waste and hazardous waste, et cetera, that will include plastics. But understanding what the plastics body is and what that would look like then would allow those of us who are working in both capacities to have that dialogue where we can say, you know, this is what's going on in one, this is what would be needed from another, rather than having duplicative or even worse, kind of canceling out or contrary views coming from those.
Thank you. And on that note, too, and even answering the question that was posed, as far as we're aware, there are no technical working groups set up right now for this purpose. But from the AOSIS end, we are hoping to have another webinar within this series where we would discuss what the body could look like, or how we could build on existing initiatives and frameworks. Sounds like you'd be very interested in that conversation, Alex, so I'll be in touch. But finally, to everyone, as we have a few short, well, we're a little over time, I will give everyone like 30 seconds just to wrap up and basically give their views on what their expectations are for the zero draft to be produced before INC-3 and what they hope it could help us achieve at INC-3 and what its contents might be. So another loaded question that you only have 30 seconds to help with. I'm sure you all love a challenge. And speaking of challenges, I think I will start with Asha Challenger.
Thank you, Saeed. So expectations for the zero draft, I hope that it will be a full zero draft with balanced proposals. So it might be a long document, might be quite a read, but I think that it's important to start with more balanced ideas. And I trust that from the discussions at INC-2 and the submissions that the chair will be able to get those views along the full text of treaty, the full life cycle, and yeah, and I think that once we have a document that we can take forward from INC-3 to establish structured discussions on priority issues. I know I agree with Halato and others that science is something that we need to ensure that is fully reflected in it. We bring in the experts sooner rather than later so that we know, so that we make the best decisions on this. So that's my that's what I hope to get. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. And it sounds like she just passed the baton over to Halatoa, so go ahead.
Thank you, Said and Asha. I think Asha's given a really good overview of what we really want to achieve from having the zero draft. I think for me, it's really the timing. And, you know, we have the advice from the Secretariat that the submissions will be made in August as well as by the 15th of September. So I guess for us as member states is what really happens between the 15th of September and the INC-3. I think that timing period is very important for us because given that the zero draft is going to be a very complex and comprehensive document because we have to reflect the full life cycle of plastics, it's all in the preparatory meetings and times that we have. So having a clear understanding of that time frame and when do we get the actual text to review will probably be important for us to make INC-3 very effective. Thank you.
Thanks, Halatoa. Fazila?
Just echoing on Asha's and Halato's comments, I'll just keep it very brief. What we really want is a full zero draft, not a partial draft. We want the whole life cycle to be covered, and hopefully the submissions will be very helpful and assisting to produce this draft. We want structure, we want clarity, and most importantly, we need time. So hopefully with all that, we can have a better INC-3.
Thank you, Fazila. Marta?
Yeah, I think what I would just add that in terms of the zero drafts, that it would also elaborate the understanding of some of the concepts like reuse, for example, but also start looking at zooming in on applications, for example, packaging, for example, because this is where a lot of the plastic waste ends up. But then in terms of what it will enable to do, so that the member states can focus negotiating the mandatory I guess requirements and prioritize those as opposed to voluntary measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. And finally, Alex?
I hope it will be full, and I expect that it will be a full draft, as everyone else does. I expect, being realistic, that it will not be perfect from anyone's perspective, and that as we go through it, we will all be able to find points that we think are excellent, points that we think we absolutely can agree with, and those in the middle. I hope that it also includes, if it is a full draft, it includes at least a significant element that will be thinking about the governance of the treaty, rather than the treaty terms itself as the only source of real discussion. Because as obviously critical as it is to have them all and to talk about them, and we will spend ages talking about them, what we have to remember is that they will be governed by the system that is set up in the treaty, and we don't want that time crunch that we'll be having to then impact on having to rush through a structure that doesn't necessarily reflect what is needed for plastics and how that can then work with other key regimes as well.
Thank you, Alex. And I think some really good highlights from everyone in the panel today. I just want to extend sincere gratitude to you all for taking the time to do this, as well as to our attendees for taking the time to listen in. This brings us to the end of the session. This recording will be available on our YouTube page, where we can find the other recordings as well. Just to steal a bit of what Alex had mentioned earlier, that it is really important for us to keep having dialogue on these issues between the sessions and maintain some level of momentum. I would strive as well to push for more bilaterals and engagements, as Asha mentioned, even with those that you may not see eye to eye with just yet. That's how we end up building bridges and meeting compromise as we approach the sessions. So I think we learned a lot from INC-2 and the roadmap to INC-3 and beyond during this. So I thank you all for your time, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet everyone. Thank you.